we're back on an early Saturday morning. What am I doing here? Like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your early Saturday morning here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So again, boxing is in the news, and I would say not for that great of a reason, because apparently, and I'll believe it when I see it, apparently sometime in the spring of 2026, so let's say 7-8 months from now, two of the all-timers are going to have an exhibition boxing match. And I don't know why this sort of thing has become a thing. The notion of, a couple of guys who don't fight anymore, except maybe just to stay in shape, to train, but guys whose professional careers proper have been done, in the case of Mike Tyson, more than 2 decades, in the case of Floyd Mayweather, 8 years, and it's arguable whether his last official professional fight should have counted, because it was against Conor McGregor, who had not had any professional fights. But then you get into Francis Ngannou and Tyson Fury. That was his first fight, and that counted. So you start getting into real weird territory. But the thing is, we are in 2025. This is the TikTok era. And this is an era where a generation of young people, thanks to social media and thanks to social apps such as YouTube, can think about fantasy fights, and you can at least put forth two people who at one time were great boxers, iconic, legendary all-timers, and you could just see them in the ring together, even if you're not going to get a real fantasy fight. Because the truth is that the real fantasy fight, it doesn't happen that often. And if I'm asked the question, in the history of boxing, and now we're not talking about exhibitions, Rocky IV, this is supposed to be an exhibition. Where do we go, Stallion? Well, Carl Weathers' Apollo Creed deals with the idea of, I got to get in an exhibition match. I'm not that old. I should be able to just fight this guy. But it turns out 6 of one, half dozen of the other. If somebody treats an exhibition match like it's a real fight and tries to kill you, you can still die. Spoiler alert, like if you die in a dream, you could still die in an exhibition match. If somebody hits you at 10,000 pounds of pressure per square inch enough times, your heart's going to stop beating and you're neurologically that's going to be it for you. But the fantasy fight, the true fantasy fight. Now, there's no version of reality, okay? Just to be clear how big of a deal weight classes are. They're not just arbitrary. So let's say that we reboot the Matrix and we have 2005 Floyd Mayweather, when he was still Pretty Boy Floyd, because you could make the argument that Pretty Boy Floyd was prime Floyd Mayweather, and Money Mayweather was when he was still great, but he wasn't quite the same. Like the Mayweather that fought De La Hoya was closer to his prime even than what Canelo saw, but Floyd was just so good, and he maintained a high level of skill. Now, Floyd is on the list of fighters who maintained a near prime or prime longer than you're supposed to. And there's not that many people on that list of the high end, like the names that I'm talking about, the top tier of boxing, legends. Roberto Duran had a very long near prime. I would say that his near prime was just as long, if not longer, than Floyd's. Now, it's a testament to the fact that yes, Floyd had good genetics, but he was a hard, diligent worker, and he did a lot of drills to try to keep that speed of his, at as high a level as it could possibly be. But if you took prime Floyd Mayweather when he was fighting at, 140, 145 pounds, and then what are we going to do? We're going to have 1988 Mike Tyson? You're not going to have a fight, because no matter how much skill Floyd Mayweather had at his absolute peak, he can't go out there against Mike Tyson. He can't. As fast as he is, the shoulder roll, Mike would bully him. He would basically grab him and start hitting to the body. The fight would be over, and I don't think that Floyd would last around. There's a reason why you have weight classes, and the Tyson that beat Spinks, that's not going to be a contest. It's going to be ridiculous, and nobody would have ever tried to put that together. Because even now there are people wondering, Canelo versus Crawford. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. There are a couple of weight classes apart. But there, many people believe that Crawford, if he's right, Crawford could win, because Crawford's style of fighting is the sort of style that just frustrates opponents, and that you got to be really careful with your shots, because you're not going to like what's coming back the other way. And Crawford, as a counterpuncher, is sort of, talking about heavyweights of bygone era, like a Jimmy Young. Jimmy Young was a guy who wasn't a big offensive fighter. He didn't throw big shots, but if he made you miss, he made you pay. As George Foreman found out, Jimmy Young answered to a trivia question, one of the only 5 men, well, it should have been 4. They gave Shannon Briggs a decision in George's last fight. 4 men who legitimately defeated George Foreman, Jimmy Young being one of them, because when George would wind up and miss, there's Jimmy Young with the counter, and eventually George ran out of gas, and he was lucky to see the final bell of that particular fight. But people are interested, and I understand, not that I need to understand, but because it's achievable now, because we're going to see Gervonta Davis versus Jake Paul. Now that's interesting. It's still not really a fair fight. Skill-wise, Gervonta is an incredible talent. We know this. But I believe that Gervonta Davis hits hard enough. I think that he's going to box circles around Jake Paul. But I get the interest factor in that fight. Jake Paul's not going to take on a top contender. Maybe he'll never be ready for that. But yeah, we know that the guy can fight. And Mike Tyson fought like somebody who really didn't want to be out there. That's the other thing. Floyd Mayweather has been doing these exhibitions, since 2018. And I really don't understand why he can't possibly need the money at this point. And he didn't have beef with Mayweather in the manner of recently Roy Jones. Like, it would have made more sense to have Floyd go against Roy Jones Jr. than Tyson. Roy, again, being, he's younger. But it's rare to have, throughout boxing history, 2 all-time greats either in their prime or at least near their prime. And because it's not exhibition stuff like today, they're going to be in the same weight class. So if I'm asked the question, what's the best example of 2 all-time legendary names who actually fought when we think they were both in their prime? Well, there's really only one fight that you can say for 100% certain. It's Leonard Hearns in 1981. Leonard had lost to Duran, tough fight, and then he beat him in the so-called no mas fight, where Duran was just tired of getting humiliated and, fuck this guy. But I know if Roberto could do it over again, he would have stayed out there and shot his bolt, and, maybe he would have been stopped, maybe he would have went to the cards. But, you don't ever want to lose a fight like that. Not that you want to get knocked unconscious, but you don't want to lose a fight like that. But even Ali Frazier, the fight of the century in 71, Ali was still really good, but that was not a fight against, it was a fight against 2 undefeated champions, one of whom was current, one of whom was former. But that was not prime versus prime in the manner of Hearns and Leonard. And then, Hearns versus Hagler is close. I would argue that they were both just a shade past their best. I feel like the Hagler of the early 80s was a little bit sharper. But you're talking about very, very thin degrees. Marvin Hagler was an absolute beast. He was a monster in there. And, a guy also on the short list, if you're asked to name who are the 10 greatest professional boxers who ever lived, you ask 100 experts, Marvin Hagler's going to appear on his share of lists. He's not going to appear as often as Ray Robinson or Ali, but he's going to be on a lot of lists. So I doubt that I'm going to end up watching Mayweather versus Tyson if it happens. And my guess is they're going to do something similar to, this is not going to be, like I say, the Tyson Fury on Ngannou, which had the form of a regular fight. I don't think that Mike and Floyd are going to fight 3-minute rounds. I think it's going to be 6 2-minute rounds, no more than that, especially because Mike seemed to run out of steam even with the Jake Paul fight, where it almost, I hate to say it almost looked like Jake was carrying him, or Mike simply didn't want to engage because there was a part of him that said, I might kill this kid if I really wind up. But I think that Mike shouldn't have been out there. I think, remember, he had the health issues. If this goes off, hopefully Mike is able to, come in and, because physically I thought he looked very good when he fought Jake, but his cardio wasn't there, and maybe because of the health issues that he had. And one thing we know with Floyd, even though he couldn't compete at the top level anymore, but Floyd is always going to be, from the cardiovascular perspective, he never seems to get tired. And that is something that there's a bit of a genetic component for sure, that some people just have lungs that they work better than they're supposed to, kind of thing. but Floyd also trains. He trains hard, even in his older era. And I remember when his fights with John Gotti III. And I never actually met John Gotti III, but we used to see each other at Bev's gym. I mean, I knew who he was. He just knew, oh, that's that guy. I always see him on the elliptical over here. But in those fights, Floyd's cardio was tremendous, and Gotti Jr. was in shape. But those fights really weren't very. I didn't think they were particularly exciting. So the most likely thing that happens, I would say, the realistic best case scenario is that Mike comes to fight and fights with a kind of a mean edge, because he suggested that that's what was going to happen when he fought Jake, but it really didn't. He had his moments early, but there really wasn't very much. The fight was not that interesting. There was not that much direct engagement between the combatants, and I'm very confident that Jake Paul, Gervonta Davis, that will be a real fight, regardless of how they are they going to judge it as a real fight, because Jake Paul can't win Gervonta Davis's title because he's 40 pounds above, or 35, whatever it is, the weight limit. Like, Jake Paul's not going to drop down to 140 pounds or 145 or whatever. It's just not going to happen. But the best guess is that Tyson Mayweather ends up being something similar to when Tyson fought Roy Jones Jr., because there were stretches there where it felt like both guys were trying, but even then, it seemed to me that Mike, well, he certainly looked better there than he did against Jake Paul, but it felt like Mike really didn't want to hurt Roy. That in the first, let's say, minute of the fight, Mike tasted what Roy had for him. Again, Mike was a lot bigger than Roy Jones Jr. Roy Jones' best weight was probably middleweight. Roy got a reputation, certainly in his older era, as a guy, who couldn't take a big shot without dropping. But when he was a middleweight, he was eating the best shots that the middleweights were throwing at him, and he was walking right through them. That's what I mean by weight class. There are punches that somebody who's natural 140 pound would be their best weight. They're walking through it, and then a guy 170 throwing it, and you're unconscious. That's how big of a difference it can be, especially when you have the guys at the elite levels. But I felt in the Jones, and it was about 5 years ago that Roy and Mike fought, that Mike was being very careful. He loved Roy as a fighter. I mean, if you ask Mike, because Mike has moments where he sometimes seems to not rank himself that highly, and other times says, no, I'm the best, or I could have been the best, or whatever. But if you ask me, relatively speaking, I mean, Roy had a better career than Mike. He should have won the Olympic gold. It's still probably the biggest travesty in the history of the Olympics. He beat that pants off the guy in the gold medal round, and they gave the wrong guy the gold medal. But a couple of years ago, I forgot the name, Soon Park, something like that, he visited Roy in Pensacola, and he apologized, even though it wasn't his fault, and he gave Roy the gold medal, which should have belonged to him. But Roy was he was a three-weight champ: middleweight, light heavy, and then heavyweight when he beat John Ruiz. So Roy at his peak, and this is what Roy was talking about when he was with Andre Ward, another undefeated, the light heavyweight champion, Andre Ward. What Roy was talking about from a conceptual standpoint, when Roy Jones was at his best, there was a sense that you couldn't even win rounds off of him. Now, Floyd Mayweather had plenty of fights where he dominated top-level opposition. Not people who were as good as Floyd Mayweather or as good as Ray Leonard when Ray was a welterweight, but top-level opposition, like Zab Judah, who maybe he got a round or two early, and then Floyd just basically embarrassed him for the rest of the fight. But there was never a sense, Floyd was dominant, but he was dominant in a different way than Roy. Where Roy went a number of years, and I don't know how many fights, where I don't think he lost a single round. He was dominant. And Mike Tyson had that kind of dominance. Although Mike, he did lose a couple of rounds. You could argue that Frank Bruno took a round or two off of him in '88. And I don't know if Bone Crusher Smith, in the Bone Crusher fight, I think that Tyson took all 12 rounds in that fight. But Tony Tucker fought him almost to a standstill. I mean, that's a 7-3, 6-4 fight. Mike won it. But Mike was dominant in a different way than Roy and Floyd. So, if I'm asked historically who was a greater fighter, I have to say that Roy was better at Mike. He came closer to actualizing his potential, because Mike, they're both, to me, I don't know if I would have Floyd in the top 5 as far as most naturally talented guys with the most tools or the most different ways they could fight. I think that Mike and Roy are in the top 5 most talented, professional fighters, just in terms of the skill sets. And this is a bit of a weird, and it's totally subjective. Well, maybe not totally. But Floyd actualized his potential. And, there is an almost idea that Floyd didn't fight all of the top guys. I mean, you look at his resume, he's got Hall of Famers up and down his resume. So, yes, he fought Canelo before Canelo hit his peak. Yeah, that's true. And if you ask me, would a Floyd Mayweather-Manny Pacquiao fight in 2009, would it have been a more difficult fight for Floyd? Absolutely. But Floyd was better in 2009 or 2007 than he was in 2015. So I don't agree with the idea that Floyd didn't fight, the best that he could at the time. Come on, the Jose Luis Castillo fight. Jose Luis Castillo was a phenomenal fighter. Diego Corrales, phenomenal fighter. Marcos Maidana, a guy who had a bigger career. People thought, well, he's just a wild swinger. Maidana was tough as nails. That's not a guy you ever, if you smile and he seems like a nice guy outside the ring. That guy was a fucking killer in the ring. Floyd fought whoever they put in front of him. The De La Hoya fight and the Castillo fight were the 2 fights where some people thought maybe Floyd's opponent, could have gotten a decision. But for the undefeated fighters, you look at, for example, the top names of Floyd and Andre Ward and Joe Calzaghe. I don't know that Joe Calzaghe, where a fight of his ever went to the cards where you weren't pretty close to 100% sure that Calzaghe was going to win. That's a guy who took full advantage of his ridiculous skill sets. Now, Calzaghe, when he moved around the ring, he didn't really look that impressive. But it's like, well, can you hit him? No. Can you hit him? No. But he's sure as fuck hitting the other guy. Calzaghe, like a very, very smooth, the way that he moved in the ring. But he also is someone who retired, arguably at the right time. This is why Andre Ward was talking about wanting to fight Anthony Joshua. You can just stay retired, bro. You're doing great. He was good in the Creed movies. I think he appeared in 2 of them. I thought he had a pretty imposing screen presence, and he could go further in that if he wanted to. But right now, nobody knows the particulars. We don't know the mechanics. And if you ask me, do I think that Floyd Mayweather and Mike Tyson will end up having an exhibition match? I think that it's not going to happen. Something's going to go wrong where they might have a date and then there's a health issue with Mike, or Floyd says, you know what, this is bullshit. I don't want to do it. I don't think this is going to happen. But yeah, at least they're both boxers. This is not 1968 and Muhammad Ali is running out of money because of the court situation and all the money he's spending to stay out of prison. And they get an idea for an exhibition boxing match between Ali and Wilt Chamberlain, who had boxed as a kid but hadn't really boxed since. Now that's like a stunt exhibition fight. This at least is 2 all-timers and young people under 30. And I mentioned about social media. They've all seen Mike Tyson's greatest hits and the various video compilations of him, knocking people's nose bone into the brain, as he famously said as a much younger person during his sort of the Mike Tyson quote machine era. And I like to push the nose bone into the brain. Nobody wants to fight me because I bring the pain. This is serious. We're in a hurting business, baby. We're in a hurt business. This is not show business. This is the hurt business. Mike is just, he's such a character. And I do appreciate, he hasn't quite had the turn in his older era as the late George Foreman, who was the sort of cutest, cuddliest, cold-blooded killer in the ring you'd ever want to meet in his older era. But speaking of fantasy fights, when Foreman was able to get the fight with Holyfield in 91, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where the sort of fight where people imagine what would happen if these 2 ever met. I don't think people really were ever obsessed about the idea of Floyd Mayweather and Mike Tyson. Maybe Floyd and Roy Jones at a catch weight, sometime in the early 2000s, but that's different. I don't think this fight is ever going to take place, and I don't really want it to. I just don't see the need, and I certainly don't want either guy to get hurt. I just don't want to see it. When you're retired, you don't need to be taking any more shots. You don't need to be taking any more blows to the head. And that's why I feel as if Jake Paul kind of took it easy on Mike. He wasn't looking to hurt him. And I think that's the way to go. But most people who watched Tyson versus Jake Paul, they were not satisfied. There was very little, real action. At least with the Francis Ngannou, both of his fights were action fights, especially, the Anthony Joshua. Joshua that was not competitive, but it shows styles make fights. And Tyson Fury's, the movement in the ring and the kind of unconventional way that Tyson Fury his attack patterns are different, certainly, than any heavyweight I've ever seen. I mean, you can tell me maybe I'm wrong. But Anthony Joshua, as a more conventional stand-up fighter, and Anthony Joshua, you could argue, has been a bit of an underachiever because he's lost a bunch of fights. But Anthony Joshua is a guy who is a solid defensive fighter. And when he's not, staggering around the ring and a little loopy from getting hit, as in the Daniel Dubois, he's very careful and cautious. And he wasn't just swinging wild against Francis. He was being very controlled and very tight with his punches. And man, Anthony Joshua is a big guy, and he can really hit. Like, that's not somebody, you don't want to fuck with that guy. You're Andre Ward. It's okay to stay retired. Anthony Joshua's past his prime, but he's still an elite level heavyweight. I would say he would still have to be ranked in the top 10, maybe the top 5. But we'll see what happens. They don't have a venue. They don't know what ounce gloves, how many minute rounds, how many rounds. That doesn't seem like, my dad would have called this sounds like a bit of a harebrained scheme. This sounds a little harebrained or a little half-baked at this point in time. And I'm sure they'll at least attempt to clarify. But again, I just hope no one gets hurt. Mike Tyson seemed to pull his punches in the latter stages of the Roy Jones fight because he didn't want to embarrass a fellow all-timer in Roy. Jake Paul appeared to be holding up a little bit against Mike, or maybe it was that Mike just didn't want to engage Jake. I don't know. You're going to get more of the same here because most of the Floyd Mayweather exhibition bouts, they're not really super exciting. It's just Floyd clowning and preening for the crowd, doing his thing and trying to entertain. But Floyd's method of entertaining is not in the manner of some of the other fights that I've talked about, and certainly nothing like, hell, even George Foreman versus Holyfield. George was, 42 at the time that he fought Evander, and Evander won the fight from here to there, but George went the distance, and, he shook Evander up a few times, and it's true that Holyfield took a hell of a shot, and there are other fighters who would have crumbled with some of those shots that George landed in like the 5th round, in the 7th round. So we'll see. I'm not exactly waiting on this with breathless anticipation, but sometime in the spring of 2026, another Legends Tour kind of an exhibition fight, this time between Mike Tyson and Floyd Mayweather. This has been episode 604 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Saturday morning here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.